It is my great pleasure to have here Professor Laurent Itti from the University of Southern California. Quite honestly, this is the first time we met in person ourselves too, but I still feel that maybe I could introduce him because I knew Professor Itti's work for quite some time. It came to my attention. I'm working in speech recognition, as you know. And you know that in speech recognition we tend to recognize what we expect. So it's not really exactly the type of information we want to get. I always had a feeling that we should be focusing more on the things which one doesn't expect, the things which come as a surprise, the things which have a very high information value. And I came across the works of Professor Itti, who deals with precisely with this issue of what is it that gets our attention in communicating with outside world. What is it that carries a large amount of surprise? What are the most surprising items? And we tried to get him in already 2 years ago in summer. I remember when I was here for a summer workshop and where we work on recognition of unexpected words. But at the time, he didn't get as lucky as this time. So finally, after a year and a half, welcome here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's not that I didn't want to come, but just the timing didn't work in previous time. So we are very lucky that the timing worked for you today. So most of my work is indeed in trying to understand attention, and in particular visual attention. And I know that here the interest may be more in auditory and speech processing, so I will try to make some of the results that we have here relevant to, more generally to the idea of detecting surprise and finding interesting events in sensory data, with vision being used as a test system for us, but hopefully some of the ideas that are developed here are also applicable to other domains, such as the auditory domain. So to get us started and into this idea of attention and what may be interesting or surprising information, these are eye movement recordings that we took in my lab from 12 different people. There are 6 males in one color and 6 females in another color, and each of those dots on the screen indicates where one of those subjects is currently looking at. I don't know if we can dim the light a little bit in the front, the projector light. In the meantime, you can try to make a guess which color for the males and which color for the females. Maybe based on this last picture here, I will take a vote. Blue is for males, indeed. This is a correct males in blue and females in red in this video. So when we watch this kind of simple eye movement recordings, this makes us think about, okay, how did people select where they decided to look? And in principle, trying to find where interesting information might be in sensory data like this one is a very complex task. If you think about the steps that one may need to take, is it that first I need to attend to all the objects that were in a scene, then for each one of those in turn, let's try to evaluate what it was, and finally, once I know what was the collection of all the objects that were in the scene, I can make some decision as to which ones were interesting and which ones were boring, and the ones that were interesting, given my current behavioral goals, maybe are the ones that I should be looking at. Okay? So in practice, if I try to perform this computation, I will be dead before I ever find my lunch or escape some predator. Okay? So there is strong evolutionary pressure to build some very quick heuristic or approximation that will help us guess where interesting information might be without doing all of the detailed processing of the data that would give rise to this kind of objective evaluation of what is interesting. Okay? So there are 2 types of heuristics that I'm going to talk about. The first type is bottom-up. Is there something in the signal, or is there some kind of fairly shallow statistical analysis of the signal that we could operate that will give us some very simple cues as to where potentially interesting elements of the data might be. And I will then tell you a little more about some more recent work that we have done on what is the role that top-down may play in making this decision of where interesting pieces of data might be. And by top-down, here I will relate to things that are related to our expectations, the internal state of the observer, and possibly the task that we are given to try to solve. I will finally tell you about some applications, including one that involves looking at this kind of video scenes and trying to determine what will be described by observers as they look at those video scenes. So let me get started with the bottom-up aspect. This is something that we have studied for quite some time. And there have been, over the years, many theories as what may constitute something interesting just based on bottom-up or signal properties. In order to study this in the visual domain, one popular approach has been to do eye movement recordings, just like I showed you. And this has been done, for example, here by Ranagel and Zeider in 1999. They showed those simple grayscale images to human subjects and recorded where their gaze, where the gaze of human subjects was distributed over those images, and then asked the question, well, was there anything special about those locations? Could we predict, using some very simple local analysis of image patches, could we have predicted where people would look? And they found that indeed, yes, there was something special. Those image patches tended to be different on average from the image patches that you would find everywhere or at random locations on those images. They had slightly more contrast. Other authors have argued that they tend to contain more information or more edge content. Ernst also analyzed this a few years ago with one of his students, looking at similar kinds of low-level visual properties that those image patches may contain. So this is maybe the simplest heuristic by which one might orient towards more interesting locations in data, maybe just by computing some simple local statistics, and based on the value of those simple local statistics, make a decision as to how interesting a given, in this case, image location might be. So, however, in parallel with this work, it has been argued that, well, actually, local statistics are only part of the answer. So if you look at this element here in the image, you may think, well, in this image, this is really the most interesting element. There is something special about it. However, if you consider now that second image, well, this element actually looks very similar to that one, but that one is very boring because there is something more interesting happening here. Okay, so this brings about the idea that, well, the local properties, the fact that this object is red and roughly horizontal, maybe that's not the end of the story. We have to look at, well, how does this fit with the overall context in which that element is being presented. Okay, so this brought out the idea that, well, maybe locations in images that are special outliers are going to become salient and are going to be those more interesting image locations that may attract attention. Okay. Finally, the same holds in time. So maybe this location here is more interesting because not because of its specific color. There are many red elements, there are many blue elements, but maybe this one is more interesting because its color is changing over time. Okay. So in order to try to investigate this, we have started developing some computational models trying to take inspiration from how we believe our brain is wired, possibly to try to approximate some of these computations. So this is one such model that we have developed over the years, in which an input image is being analyzed by some low-level feature detectors, which we believe exist and operate in your brain. And those give rise to some very simple so-called feature maps, which basically contain responses from those different feature detectors over the entire visual field. Now, within each of those feature maps, some competition is operated, which tends to highlight those locations which indeed are outliers, statistical outliers compared to other locations. And once this is operated here at the level of those different features, we have then hypothesized that the output from these different features combines into a single salience map. And the brighter the gray level here, the more interesting is this model predicting that a given location might be. So in this case, it predicts that, okay, the most interesting spot is here, which corresponds to this bag of money. And of course, it has no idea of what a bag of money might be. This is just based on the fact that, well, the statistics, the local visual statistics of the image at this location are significantly different from what they are at other locations in the image.
The right lower corner.
What did it find here? So sometimes some of those responses are at a very coarse resolution, which I believe may be the case here, that locally this patch of grass is fairly different from the surrounding edge here and the surrounding gray road or something over there. Yeah. So if we take this very simple, simple-minded model, we can apply it. So I'm going to show you some pictures in which we can start with very simple, like search arrays, and the output of the model in those videos is indicated by this yellow circle. And you can see that when we show images where there is an odd man out, like slightly different shapes, this model tends to indeed detect those outliers. We can then extend this to natural scenes and make some open-ended predictions as to, well, where are those statistical outliers present in the images. And often we find that there is a good correlation with what we would consider are interesting objects, like maybe people or faces or animals. And even so, again, this model is very stupid. It doesn't have any concept of people or faces or animals. But maybe this reinforces this idea of a heuristic, that just finding statistical outliers in the visual domain is a fairly good predictor of where faces and people and animals are going to be. And so maybe this is the kind of very rapid and very shallow analysis that could be considered a good heuristic to guide attention towards potentially interesting things. All right, there are many applications. I'm not going to talk about this, but instead tell you how can we then try to improve on this. So this model was interesting in that it implemented this notion of outliers. However, it didn't necessarily address, okay, what is the best possible way to find those interesting locations. So this is something that we then started studying, and in order to look at that, we decided, okay, let's try to step back and think about what it may mean for some information to be more interesting or more relevant, or in our case, more surprising than different pieces of information. So when talking about information, of course, the starting point is to say, well, let's look at Shannon. Maybe he already had all the answers that we have been looking for. And so here is the definition that is proposed to quantify how informative some data might be. And of course, this is fine for communication, and it has given rise to a whole industry. But there are problems which arise from the fact that if you look here at the definition, this is all about the data. We look at the different values that the data could take, so that the data that we observe might take, and then try to integrate over all possible values, and that's it. This notion is objective, and it is entirely data-centric. Okay, so this is fine when you are concerned with communication and how much will it cost me to transfer this data from one place to another or to communicate this data. But Shannon's theory of information has not been as successful in other domains where the emphasis is not so much on the cost of communication, but on things like value or importance, relevance, or surprise. So more subjective aspects of information that may not be well captured by this very objective definition of information here. So a particular example of this is the so-called white snow paradox. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, it's always an interesting question for students when they start learning about information theory. And the paradox is, how come that the most boring of all possible television programs, which is when I disconnect the antenna and just observe white snow, is the one that, according to Shannon, carries the most information. Okay? And this is something that I can indeed measure very easily. I can take some TV and I compress it using MPEG to remove redundancy. And with regular TV like this, this is the rate that I get for the given settings of my compression algorithm. If I take the same algorithm and I apply it to snow, it's about 15 times more information according to Shannon. Okay? So here we are today in a situation in which, let's say I send you an email attachment, and you say, wow, this attachment is very big. Is it going to be interesting? Well, maybe, maybe not, right? It could be very boring and still contain a lot of bits according to Shannon. Or it could be potentially more interesting and still be a smaller file size than this very boring stimulus here. Okay? So this shows that there is some disconnect between Shannon's way of measuring information and some subjective dimension of information that may be more important to us, which is, well, how much interest will I have into this piece of data, or how important is it going to be to me, how surprising is it going to be. Often people tell me, oh, maybe this is just an artifact that your MPEG video compression was not designed to compress noise. But it's not, right? The fact here is just that this is a very small subset of this ensemble. So there are many more images of snow than there are which are natural scenes. And so just because this ensemble is so much bigger, it will not be possible to obtain a code which is as efficient or as compact as for this ensemble. Okay? And if you're still not convinced of that, just write a piece of MATLAB code that generates random noise and tell me how often you end up with an image that looks like something understandable. Okay? And it will take many iterations of you generating random noise like this until you recognize something in it, like the Virgin Mary, if you remember that story. And so that will give you some idea of how small of a subspace this is to this space, and hence why it is possible to find a more efficient code for this kind of images than for those images. Okay? So how can we try to fix that? So the idea was, let's shift the emphasis. So Shannon was interested again in the data and how does a particular piece of data that is observed relate to all the possible observations. Instead, we are going to try to step away from this and shift the emphasis not to not look exclusively at the data, but to putting the observer at the central location. So our emphasis will be on trying to evaluate the internal state of an observer, and as data is received, it will be absorbed by the observer, but the data itself is not so important, and what will be our focus is how much did the observer change as a function of observing the data. Okay? So I will give you the graphical definition. Let's do a very simple setup just to motivate how we are going to define surprise. Let's assume that you just turned on the TV and you don't know which channel it's on, and you want to try to guess that fairly quickly. And you may have several possible hypotheses about which channel may be on. Maybe you are watching MTV or CNN or Fox or whatever. So those beliefs may be shaped by a number of things. Maybe you know that your kids always watch CNN, so already, even before you start looking at the images, you may have a higher belief, which is represented here. What's your belief that you are watching one channel versus another? Okay? So we are going to consider this distribution of beliefs over those different hypotheses or models about the world. Okay? And here I'm going to call this the prior set of beliefs, and it's prior to the arrival of the next frame, the next image in this sequence of images here. And what I would like to do is to again motivate, okay, what happens if the next image that comes in is pretty boring versus what happens when it is surprising, okay? And so we are going to look at what happens to this distribution, and that will motivate how we are going to define surprise. So I hope everything is clear here. We just have a family of models or hypotheses about the world. In this case, these are my different hypotheses about different TV channels. and we start with a prior set of beliefs prior to the arrival of the next piece of data. So as the next piece of data arrives, we need to decide what are we going to do with it. And so in this case, what we are going to do is in a Bayesian framework to say, let's just use the data to update our views about the world. Okay? So here we will just use this data and basically transition from our prior beliefs to a set of posterior beliefs, which is what are my updated beliefs about the world once I have observed this particular piece of data. So let's look at those two possible events. Let's first look at the situation in which the next frame that arrives is still one from that same program. So intuitively, I would like to say, oh, that was not very surprising. Okay, I kind of knew that I was watching CNN, and now the next image comes in. I'm still watching CNN. That should not elicit a very big surprise in my observer. And so indeed, if I compute my posterior here, so in order to do that, I need to know, okay, how likely was this frame if it was MTV? Well, it was not very likely. So actually, my belief that I'm watching MTV is going to go down a little bit. How likely was this frame if I was watching CNN? Oh, it was pretty likely. So my belief that I'm watching CNN is going to go up a little bit. And I can do that for all of those hypotheses. Okay? So in this case, again, intuitively, I would say, well, that was a pretty boring event. And in particular, if I compare it to another event, which is, let's say that suddenly I now observe a frame of snow. So intuitively, I would like to say, oh, this might be a very surprising event. Something happened. Maybe there was an earthquake. Maybe someone suddenly decided, to finally nuke CNN and get rid of it once and for all. Whatever it is, this was a very interesting piece of data here. And intuitively, I would like to say, oh, that was quite surprising. And so indeed, if we update, so if we use the data and compute what are my new beliefs, well, because this kind of image is quite unlikely when I'm watching CNN, my belief that I'm watching CNN has now gone down quite a bit. And conversely, my belief that I'm watching some snow is going up. Okay? So this motivates us to compare those two situations here. There was something interesting, and it looks like my posterior was quite different from the prior. When there was something pretty boring, it looks like, well, not much happened here. And when it was more interesting, oh, those two distributions are quite different now. Okay, so this just motivates us to compute surprise as some kind of difference. How much is the prior different from the posterior? And so some kind of distance function that will compare those two probability distributions. Okay. Note how this resolves the white snow paradox. So after a moment, if I have been observing snow for a while, I still cannot predict the snow, so the snow is still carrying a lot of information. But my beliefs are stabilized that, well, most likely I am watching snow. Could still be MTV, you are never sure, but most likely it's snow. And as new snow frames arrive, I'm still not able to predict them. I still don't know how they are going to look. But my beliefs that each time I observe a new frame of snow, it doesn't modify my belief that, okay, I knew I was watching snow and I still know it. Okay? So even so, each frame of snow carries a lot of information in Shannon's sense. After a while, once the beliefs are stabilized, it carries very little surprise, and the surprise is only initially, as there is this transition from believing that I'm watching CNN to believing that I'm watching snow. All right, so to summarize, we can hence define surprise in those terms, some kind of distance measure between the posterior and the prior. This requires, for example, for this distance measure, we can use the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is what we did here. And note how this requires integration over the space of all models, or all hypotheses that I may have about the world, which is fundamentally different from integrating over the space of all possible values that the data might take, which is what Shannon is doing. So here really we are looking at how did my internal beliefs change as a result of observing the data, and Shannon is in contrast interested in looking at how likely was this data and was it something rare or not. All right, you may think that, oh, this is going to be totally intractable. There is no way I will ever compute this. However, there are a number of cases in which actually surprise can be computed in closed form. So this integration over the space of model can actually be computed in closed form. Finally, just like Shannon defines the bit, we can define a unit of surprise, and we are going to call it a wow. And we can, so a wow is experienced at the level of a single model when you had some belief in that model, and that belief has changed by a factor 2 because of observing data. Okay, so and you can have positive or negative wows depending on whether your belief doubled or halved as a function of observing the data. Okay. So how can we then now try to use that and revisit this idea of attention and what things may be more interesting in video streams and eye movements and so on. So the idea is, let's try to take this model, which is the one that I've shown you before, but we are going to now hypothesize that in each of those neurons, so these are again those feature maps that are sensitive to different features of the data, like some here are looking for different colors or different little oriented edges or different ways in which things are moving. And let's assume that now in each of those feature maps, instead of just outputting the raw presence or absence of an edge, let's try to output, was there or not a surprising edge at this location. And the surprising edge would be, well, because maybe before we believed that there was no edge, and now suddenly we believe that there is an edge, and so that's a surprising edge. Okay. And we can then hypothesize, well, if the model is correct, it will hence, when we combine all those different features together into this salience map, that salience map should be a good predictor of where people are actually going to look in those videos, right? So whenever something surprising happens, if really this model has any relevance to human vision, then it should somewhat predict where people's attention is going to be guided so as to find interesting or surprising information in video. So just to clarify what the models may be, in order to compute surprise, right, we said, oh, we need to have like a prior set of hypotheses or models about the world. How is this going to work at the level of a single neuron? So here we can imagine one neuron that is, that has a receptive field or that is sensitive to a given portion of the visual space. And let's say that this neuron is in some kind of color feature map. So, well, what kind of internal models and internal hypotheses may this neuron have? Maybe it's something very simple, like the space of models is, well, how much do I believe that the world is green right now? How much green is there in the world? And so in the case of this neuron, it has multiple hypotheses, or there could be a low amount of green, or a medium, or a high amount of green. And this is my current distribution of beliefs about how much green there is at this location in the world. Okay? Here is another one that doesn't really know how much horizontal there might be in the world. And here is another one which is pretty sure that there is a low amount of upward motion in the world at this location. Okay? And so surprise would arise at the level of those single neurons whenever some new data comes in. So for simplicity, we are going to say each time a new video frame comes in, that will trigger some update of this distribution of beliefs. And whenever the update is significant, that will create some surprise. And this is then what we are going to encode in those surprise maps. Does this make sense to everybody? It's quite a simple model. Okay. So we can then use that and make some predictions. So we are going to show some video clips, like some TV, to a bunch of human observers. And as they watch TV, they are going to look. The contrast is very poor on the projector, but here there are two people walking, and there is another one here. And at this point in time, one of our human subjects, was looking here and decided, oh, I'm going to look there. And the question is, well, why did that happen? Why did this person decide to shift gaze from looking here towards looking there? Maybe it's because there was something interesting or surprising happening at this location. So this is something that we are going to quantify by computing over the video frames. We are going to use our model to compute those surprise maps. So in this case, the model predicts, oh, there was a surprising something happening here and another surprising something happening there. And we can now, count, okay, how many times was gaze directed towards something surprising versus what we would expect by chance, okay, if we were just making random eye movements. And so if we find that people tend to look at those surprising blobs more than you would expect by chance, then maybe this indicates that this quantity of surprise, as we are computing it here, may indeed have some relevance with the way our brain interprets those images and decides where to look. So here is one movie, very simple. You can see in the center saying there is that little square that's jumping around. This is the eye movements, so the eye position. So this is the current point of gaze of one human observer watching this movie. Let me show you some other one here. And that one human observer, as you can see, is interested in various things. In this case, for example, the players in that soccer game. And the question is, okay, are those also the things that will interest our model? And you can see that here, indeed, most of what the model considers is surprising or interesting was clustered around those players. Okay? Here is another example. You can see that our observer looks at the anchor for a second or two and then moves on and reads that text, which is much more surprising and much more interesting. So 2 hours of makeup for nothing. People didn't really look at her, but preferred to just read the text. We showed about 45 minutes, I believe, of video to subjects like this. And what we can do is, over all the eye movements, so in total we collected about 10,000 such shift of gaze or so-called saccades. And we can just make a histogram to what kind of surprise value were those saccades directed. Okay? Were they directed towards low surprise value? So indeed, well, there was about 2,000 saccades that basically shot into the dark. Okay? But there was actually quite a significant number that were towards very high surprise values according to the model. And so here this is all the ones that were between 0.9 and 1, and in particular this is all the eye movements that were directed to the single most surprising pixel in the image. Okay? And so the question, of course, is, well, this by itself doesn't mean too much because I could easily make a model where everything is surprising. So I need to compare this to the, if you want, the intrinsic distribution of how much surprising stuff was there in my images. And so this I can estimate by looking at taking those random samples, or making those random eye movements. So here, if you compare for this bin, you find, oh, okay, well, people, about 2,000 times, so about 1 in 5 eye movements, they looked at something that the model didn't predict was interesting. But just by chance, you would predict that, oh, this should be in more than 50% of the cases. Okay? So if you were just to make random eye movements, a majority of them would, well, not really a majority, but a lot of them would end up at locations which carried no surprise. And actually, here it seems that our human observers avoided, to some extent, looking at those locations that carried no surprise. Okay? Conversely, if you look at the other end of the spectrum here, it is very rare that just by chance you hit the most surprising point in the picture. Sometimes it happens, but much less often than what people did. Okay, so people tended to look at this most surprising location in the image much more often than you would expect by chance. All right, so in order to quantify how predictive was the model, we can just look at the difference between those two distributions, for example, using KL. So for we can then rank different kinds of models, looking at how well they are going to predict where people look. And so here is, for example, for one model which is only considering color contrast and only looking at how often do people look at locations that have a very high color contrast. Okay? And well, it's significantly above chance. Chance would be 0. It's significantly above chance, but maybe not the strongest model. Here are different other candidates. The one that works the best so far is surprise. Otherwise, I would have told you about some other model that worked better. Yes?
Surprise doesn't in some way, it's a composite.
Yes. So surprise
so
in this case will combine
right.
Several of those different features.
So do you have the distance? I mean, the performance.
So this is just those features, but without the surprise component. So this is kind of our old saliency model, which also combines all the features, but doesn't have this extra surprise detection thing. Yeah. So we still do significantly better with the new model. One that I wanted to show you is the Shannon entropy, which is a very simple version of Shannon entropy. This is as was used previously by Privitera and Stark. In which here we are just measuring, okay, in a given image patch, how much entropy or how much information there is. And you can see that this model doesn't do as well. And part of the reason I just want to show you this video, this is looking at this measure of entropy. Well, first of all, you find, oh, there is a lot of entropy here. This is a very interesting pattern. But, well, people never looked at it. And the other thing is that, often, especially in this kind of video, there is a lot of entropy everywhere. Maybe not. So this is a case where maybe there are only a few locations that are interesting, but you will see in subsequent images of this movie. Often there are situations in which there is entropy everywhere. For example, in this case, well, where do I look here? Based on this image, it looks like everything is a good candidate for me to look at. Everything is highly informative, according to Shannon, right? Everything contains a lot of potentially interesting information. So this model doesn't perform as well because it basically has too many false positives. It's just telling you that everything is worth looking at, it doesn't help you in narrowing down onto just one possible interesting location.
But in the example of the fingers, you're sending a message.
So in the example of the fingers, yes.
You're sending a message to this place.
Yes. That's much more high level than what we are trying to analyze with this thing. Right? So my point here is that if I ask you on this image, where would you look? And well, if I use this model from Shannon, it's telling me that I could look here or 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 here, and I don't know which one to pick. Right? While surprise was more selective in that it would narrow down on a smaller set of candidates. Yep.
When you have like the motion or whatever, you have the video, your prior distribution is a function of time?
Yes. So in this case, what we have assumed is that your prior gets updated each time there is a new image in the video sequence. So we just learn them over time. So in the videos that I'm showing you, we initially assume that, actually not in this one because that's Shannon. We initially assume that the system has been watching black forever. And so that's how all the priors start. They just believe that the world is black. And then the video starts, and over the course of the first second or two of the video, you can see that at the beginning there is a little bit of surprise everywhere, and then over a second or two, those priors are being learned over time. Yeah. All right. So let me now address. Yep.
So the priors are updated each step, so there's some sort of Markov assumption, right? Once you get new priors, the old one.
Not really. So we just do a Bayesian update, and we have a forgetting factor. So if you were to be a pure Bayesian learner, each time you observe new data, you would learn from it, and after a while, you can show that surprise would converge to 0 because basically you become blasé. Once you have seen it all, nothing will surprise you anymore. Okay. So in order to avoid this, because it's a little annoying in this video example, we assume that there is only short-term memory, so that you are going to forget your prior over time. And so we have a forgetting factor, which basically tells you that indeed there is some kind of Markov assumption that only the past up to some point matters in determining what is your current set of beliefs at the current point. Yep.
And so your performance is a monotonic decreasing function of that time?
Good question. We haven't tried it, but I think that would be a valid prediction. So if you don't have this forgetting factor, what you expect is that at the beginning, a lot of things, at the beginning of a given video clip, a lot of things are going to be surprising, and then after a while, just the whole surprise map fades to black because nothing is surprising anymore, right? You just have seen all kinds of things, and now nothing can surprise you anymore. So indeed, I expect that a model that would have this property where the whole map fades to black over time would do worse.
You want to have an automatic way of adjusting that.
Of adjusting what the time constant of that fading should be. Yes. So so far we don't have that. It's mostly for computational reasons. So we have a cluster of 64 computers, and it still takes a day to evaluate all of this data against all of the eye movement data. So we haven't really played with the parameters too much. But that's certainly something that should be done. Yep.
One more question. So are the priors updated globally or locally?
It's locally. It's for each of those neurons that is looking at a little portion of the visual field and for a specific feature, right? So some neurons are just sensitive to color contrast. Some other neurons are sensitive to orientation, and so each one of those neurons has a prior.
The horizontal field over here doesn't care about the horizontal field someplace else.
Actually. It does, to some extent. There is some communication across those different neurons, but I'm just glossing over all of those details. But indeed, so in this model, we have some notion that surprise should be something that is local and temporal. So your prior should be informed by your previous history of stimulation, but it should also be informed by your neighbors. So in the full model, we make this distinction, and this is actually necessary if you want to reproduce this pop-out. Those search arrays where there is like one red guy among a bunch of green guys, you need to have information from your neighbors if you want to be able to say that this red guy is surprising, because just on its own, it's not more surprising than any other element. Yep. All right, so let me say a little bit about how can we improve on those models. Clearly, with this kind of very simple-minded analysis of video stimuli, we are not going to be able to predict each and every eye movement, right? I'm not trying to claim this at all here. I'm very happy that we are doing above chance, but there are still many things that come into play when you look at complex stimuli that will determine where you look and which are not explained by this simple notion of surprise. So in order to start investigating what are those other factors, things that may have to do with a particular task, we decided to, let's look at trying to do this same kind of eye movement experiments, but we are going to now give a task to our subjects. So instead of just passively watching, they are going to play video games, and those different kinds of video games, which are mostly going to be things like driving games, like driving a jet ski or driving a kart. We will have flight simulators and these kind of things. And so the idea here is to try to see, well, depending on the task, what is going to change in the patterns of eye movements. And intuitively, if I'm driving versus being a passenger in a car, certainly when I'm the driver, there are some places that I need to look at, and that ought to influence my gaze allocation. And is that something that we could take into account in some kind of computational model? Okay, so trying to take top-down or task into account. To very briefly relate this to the literature, the way in which we are trying to position this is we want to build a model which is quantitative. So just like the salience or surprise map model, we want to be able to take arbitrary videos and make some explicit prediction of where people would look in those videos, and to do that with stimuli which are interactive and natural. So this is somewhat different from quite a lot of studies that have looked, in particular in the lab of Mary Hayhoe, that have looked at what happens to gaze during natural tasks, but she doesn't have a computational explanation. So some experimenter is manually interpreting, here, he looked at this object and then he looked at that object, and then trying to understand why those different eye movements happen in this particular sequence, but without having an end-to-end computational model. All right, so how can we hope doing that? I'm going to present a very simple approximation to computing this, how these top-down influences may play onto attention. And the idea is that I will not claim to have a model which is generative, to understand how the knowledge of the task may influence where people might look as they are executing the task. Instead, what we will try to do is to learn a very simple association between the kinds of scenes that people are presented with and the locations where they look. So during a training period, we are going to have our subjects play those video games, and we are going to try to learn an association between, okay, this is the way the image looked like, and this is where people typically looked at for this kind of scenery. Okay? And we will just try to learn this kind of association. And so the idea is that this association should capture some aspect of the task. If I was trying to drive, then maybe what the system will learn is something like this, that like, oh, when the pass, this is like this jet ski video game, and when the pass was turning to the left, then observers tended to look more, roughly on the horizon line and more towards the left side. However, when the pass was turning to the right, then observers tended to look more on the horizon line and maybe more towards the right side. Okay? So if we could capture this aspect, which is task dependent, then maybe this is something that we can use as an additional component when we make predictions of where people are going to look. Well, if we know that the path is turning right, then maybe we can emphasize this portion of the space when we make a prediction for where the gaze is going to go. Okay? So I hope it's not too confusing. I will show you some examples. Let me first skip a couple of slides, which were just to motivate how we are going to do this association. Just trust me, it can be done in a reliable way. Okay, so I'm just going to skip those slides, which were basically to try to convince you that it is possible to distinguish from between a road turning left and a road turning right based on some simple image analysis.
What's the dimensionality of these features?
So in our case, it's 80 dimensions, and so we have for each image we extract a signature which is fairly low dimensional, 80 dimension, and then we just learn the association between this feature vector, which again may correspond to a road turning left, and the fact that people tended to look towards the left. What are the random features? This is a very good question. Oh, okay. This is just to create a control model. So those features, they can come from different algorithms to basically summarize an image in just a vector of 80 numbers. As a control, you could also just generate random features and see whether you are going to learn something. And if you do, then there is a problem that that actually you have learned something which is independent from the stimulus, because it learned the same thing whether you fed it features that came from the stimulus or random features. Yep.
Does the user input serve as a feature, or is it just on the image? So the controller button pressing?
Yeah, we are now recording this, but it's not being used in this data. So in this data, the only user input that we have is the gaze location, right? So we learn the association between what were they looking at and where they looked. And so now we can make a prediction, when I have this picture that looks like this, like say a road turning left, I predict people will look roughly in this location. Okay. So let me show you a demo just to hopefully clarify things a little bit. So I'm going to play this movie. This is again this jet ski video game, and there are several markers that are superimposed. Let me maybe advance it a little bit so that they don't overlap so much. All right. So. And everything is color-coded. So as the player is playing this movie, we record, in this case, his gaze, and that's at the center of this orange circle, and the same circle is here reproduced on those 4 panels. Okay? So this is what we are trying to predict. This is the true location of gaze while this player was playing this video game. This is, of course, each run in this thing is unique, right? So we couldn't have trained the model on exactly that one run because nobody has played that game in exactly that same way before, right? This is a unique run of this player playing the game and controlling the display. So we can run some bottom-up salience map model on this display, and in this case we find that, oh, the guy just turned, and so there is like a big splash that is being made in this corner of the picture, and that ends up being the most salient location. So the bottom-up model in this case predicts, oh, you should be looking in this region of the screen because there is this big splash that just happened, and that's interesting, and it's bottom-up salient. Okay? So it turns out in this case the observer didn't do it, and so to some extent it may be because that bottom-up signal that came from the videos maybe was overridden by the need to keep driving, okay, and by the task demands. And so indeed this is something that we can now try to capture with this learning model. Yep.
But the player has played a game like this before.
Yes, yes.
So the truly naive player.
Yes, yes.
So
Exactly. The player has learned to play this game, and also the way in which we train. So this is this association model, and the way in which we train that is by having people play this kind of game, and that one game before. Okay. So even so, that exact image has never been seen before because it is unique. What we have trained is, making the association between this kind of appearance, so scenes that look roughly like that, and where people were looking as they were presented with things that looked roughly like that, and they were engaged in the task of driving the jet ski. Okay? So in this case, what we find is that, well, when the scenery looks like that, what this model has learned is that you should roughly keep your eyes on the horizon line and with maybe a little bit of a bias towards the center. And so the prediction that this top-down model makes is here in red, and it's telling you, okay, I think that's where you should look. Now what we can do is to take those two maps and basically do a point-wise multiplication, so to say, oh, let's only focus on the locations that are salient, but that are not outside this region that is relevant to the task. And so we get a modified salience map, if you want, that has been filtered to remove irrelevant locations. And hopefully we get now a better prediction. In this case, it's actually not better than just the top-down only, but it's definitely better than the bottom-up prediction. Okay, so this is just for that one video frame. Now we can run it for a whole movie. And so the question is, is this or this model going to do better than the purely bottom-up model? And so what we find when we try to quantify this over a large number of video games and observers is that indeed it does significantly better than the purely bottom-up model would do at predicting eye movements. Okay? So I will show you the data in the next slide, but the message here is that, well, this kind of information also matters, and actually matters a lot. It can very strongly modify here, this prediction that is made based on purely bottom-up information. In this kind of game, for example, very often it is wrong because it's attracted towards salient events that may happen here in the wake of the jet ski. So the additional information that comes from knowledge of the task can very strongly also influence the eye movements.
What is the red circle? What was the red circle?
So the red circle was from the top-down model only. Okay, so it's the maximum of where the top-down map is. Here the blue or whatever circle is the maximum salience, and the purple circle is the maximum of these combined two sources of information.
So is there have you looked at how often the person looks at either the time or the track to know where it is, so it can actually change the thing?
How often do they? Oh, yeah, that's exactly my next point. How much time do I have? I think I have only a few minutes, so let me try to accelerate a little bit. So indeed, what we notice is, like, for example, in games like this, it seems that there are different phases. For example, here the guy is tracking the plane and then shoots the plane, and it's a first blood, and then the player starts looking at his radar and some other things until the next plane comes over. Okay, and so having the availability of those models, we started thinking about, okay, maybe those models will be able to predict when those shifts in those different subtasks may happen. You know, for example, between tracking and looking back at the radar and these kind of things. So indeed, we looked at those things. So here is, for example, for target destroyed events. There is a curve here, which appears very vividly on my screen, but not on yours. So over time, during a video game session, once in a while, a target gets destroyed. Okay, so here we are just recording those times. As those game events happen, you can see here, we can also extract video frames around those, and then we can ask, well, was there anything special about those events? And how can we ask this? Well, we can use the same models as we have used before. So we can look at salience maps around the time of those events. And we can also look at predictions from this so-called top-down model, which again has been trained to associate different types of images with different preferred locations to look at. Okay? So we can do that, and the way in which we are going to do it is let's record eye movements of players as they play, and then over time we can, over a sliding window, we can basically compute this agreement between where people were looking and where we predicted they would look. Okay, so here this is that blue curve. It's where did the saliency model predict the observer looked compared to where they actually looked. And we quantify that with a score which is called NSS, which is like the normalized scan pass salience. And the score of 0 would indicate that, well, people are just looking in, at some places that are unrelated to what the salience map is predicted. And when this score shoots up here to being larger than 0, it means that, oh, the saliency model is now suddenly very, very well predicting where people are looking. Okay? So we can do that for the salience model, and we can do that similarly for the that top-down model. And here you can see that indeed, what happened is that maybe 3 or 4 seconds before the target was destroyed, something happened that was predicted by those models. Suddenly, our observer became more bottom-up driven in this case, so it was better. The eye movement of the observer was suddenly much better predicted by this bottom-up model, and was less well predicted by this top-down model. And this forms a signature of a predictive signature of when this target destroy event is going to happen. Okay? Here is just another one, which is when the observer actually pressed the trigger. So this is a slightly different event, missile-fired event, as opposed to target destroyed event, and still some kind of signature. Now, this is kind of the ERP of things. If you want, this is averaged over many trials. We can see that there is some significant difference from the baseline level that is occurring a few seconds before the event on average. Now, how about the single trial? The EEG saying, could we predict on a single trial whether those things are actually going to be happening? And so indeed we can. And so here this is just showing you an ROC and the precision recall. So here we can see that the performance is highly significantly above chance on a single trial. So just looking over time and making a binary prediction. When are those events? When is our observer going to press the trigger? Okay, and so here, just by recording the eye movements, basically, highly reliably, 3 or 4 seconds before people actually press the trigger, we know that they are going to do it. Just by recording the eye movements and making all of those predictions with those computational models. And it's interesting to note that if we only had the eye movements, we would still be able to do it, but not as well. So just by monitoring the eye movements, not even knowing what the stimulus is, so there is clearly something that's going on, right? Just before you shoot the missile, maybe you start making more jittery eye movements, or on the contrary, maybe fix your gaze onto the target, And so you would be able to predict, but when those missile firing is going to occur, but not as well as if you know the behavior and the stimulus. And from the stimulus only, you can predict, but here the performance becomes quite poor. Even so, it's still significantly above chance. So this is
the red is.
It's combined. So when you know you have access to the image, which will give rise to this bottom-up salience map and the top-down map, and you have also access to the eye movements of the subject. And this is when you only have access, you only look at the eye movements, but you don't know what the image is. And this is if you only try to analyze the image and try to predict when are people going to shoot, just based on analyzing the image. All right, let me skip. I had another example of another video game, which was a driving game, but we don't need to look at that. I would like, in closing, to just open up the discussion. It's going to take another 5 minutes, if that's okay. Otherwise, I can skip this part, but it's actually quite neat. It's a very simple study that we did, which is kind of an application of all this, and trying to open it up more towards high-level cognition. And so here is the idea. Just tell me what's happening in this video clip. Don't tell me that the quality is very poor. I already know that. So what happened in the video clip?
The girl went around.
The what?
The girl for the boy.
All right, it's actually a boy, but yes, there was a boy on a scooter going around, okay? So the idea here is that we humans are very good at taking video clips like that and telling you a very short story. So this story, in work with Michael Arbib, we call it the minimal subscene. So what is the smallest set of actors, objects, and actions that describe the scene under a given task definition, right? So in this case, I asked you describe what you see. You saw the video clip, and then your minimal subscene description of this video clip was, there was a boy, in a red skirt driving a scooter around. And so, of course, we are very good at doing that. But if you think of it as an information processing problem, we ended up with 10 words. But actually, believe it or not, you just observed 1.8 billion bits, that were flashed on your retinas through those projectors as this clip was unfolded. So how do we go from that many bits to that few words?
They're really long words, right?
Is a very good. They are English words, okay? Yes, but they are not words in Shannon sense. So clearly there were a lot of things that have influenced your answer to my question. One is that maybe you noticed that the camera was following the boy over time, and so clearly that may have influenced your decision. Another is that maybe some objects were more behaviorally relevant than others. And you may have different preferences, different cultural interests. And one thing that we wanted to look at here is that last hypothesis. Well, is there anything in the low-level image properties that could have guided this selection? Okay. So the question here is there anything that we can compute from the image that will predict which of those words are going to be part of your description, that can basically predict which of the objects are going to end up in your very high-level summary of this video clip. And is that something that we can predict from low-level image properties? So, of course, those properties, we are going to use this model to compute them. If we run this model on this video clip, it's difficult to follow, but there is that little filled yellow square here. It's in the corner now somewhere. But this is just looking at applying the salience model. And if we do it on this video clip, we actually notice that, for most of the time, that boy on his scooter was pretty salient. So is that something that could have contributed to my decision to talk about the boy on the scooter and to ignore other things that may have happened, like the fact that, this is at the beach, and there are a lot of trees and a lot of people on bikes and a lot of dogs and whatever, right? So why didn't I talk about any of those things, and instead I focused on the boy on the scooter? So again, there are many reasons for that, and here we are just going to try to look at, well, did low-level salience play a role? At least in this example, it looks like this kid was salient, and so maybe that contributed to my decision of what I was going to talk about. So this slide is just to say that this is potentially a non-trivial step, right? So we know that attention is necessary for us to perceive something. So unless you attend to something, often you are not going to talk about it or report it or be aware of it. We know that from the previous data that I showed you, that salience is a reasonable predictor of what attracts attention and where people look. But going to look somewhere maybe is not all there is to deciding that this thing is interesting, right? You may be attracted towards something salient, like, oh, there is an exit sign over there. But maybe that's not what I want to talk about when people ask me, okay, so what happened when you went to Hopkins and gave a talk? Oh, well, there was an exit sign, So relevance should have something else to do. Maybe there are other things in this room that are less salient, but more worthy of being part of my consciously described and recalled description of this scene. Okay? So here is what we are going to do. We showed some video clips to a bunch of people, and we asked them, please describe what you see. So just like I asked you. So the eye tracking becomes a little shady when people start moving their jaw, but it still can be done. You will see the quality of the data is not as good, but still we roughly get the idea. So there is now some audio. Let me see if that's going to work.
Looks like a cathedral of some kind or a sacred place. There's a person worshiping in the bottom left part of the image. Now looks like the inside of some kind of sacred building. Man's walking in and bowing his head down upon some kind of altar. Now there looks like there's some members of clergy.
All right.
Guided trees, rocks, shrines there. Something with a smoke. Smoke seems to be coming out of the water. Oh, there's a Mexican monkey over in Japan. There's another rock. Oh, shoot. There's a monkey with eyes crystallized on its hairs.
All right, so as this unfolds, we are here also computing those salience maps, right, that are making very simple bottom-up predictions that, oh, maybe this is a worthy place to look at in this particular image. And so we are going to try to now connect the two, which, of course, is going to be a very ill-posed and very bogus problem. So don't take this study too seriously. This is just the end of the talk, right? It's entertainment. And it's just a preliminary data. I'm going to skip this one. But so basically what we can try to do, and again, there are a lot of issues with doing it properly. Again, this is only a pilot study at this point. We can take those verbal reports and try to parse them. So in the current analysis, we have decided to focus on objects. So sometimes people describe other things like, oh, it seems like it's hot. And it's like, okay, which eye movement could I relate to the fact that it's hot? Good question. So in this case, we decided, all right, let's just look at when they talk about specific objects, and then we are going to try to see, when did they look at those objects, and were those objects salient when they looked at them. So first we tried, so we manually parsed this, which already involves some subjectivity, and then we can make an association and try to, again, so to now associate, at some point our observer talked about a man, and it looks like there was one saccade. In this case, the first eye movement was directed towards a man. Then our observer talked about a book, and it looks like three eye movements were made to this book. In this case, 3 successive eye movements. So saccade, eye movement number 1 went to the man, then 2 and 3 went to other things that were not described. 4, 5, and 6 were just 3 eye movements made to the book. 7 went to something else. Then 8, 9, 10, 11 went to something that was later described as someone, and so on. Okay, does the analysis make sense so far? So then we can ask the following simple question. How is the model going to well, is there going to be some kind of, what is the salience going to be for random locations versus locations where people looked at versus locations where people looked at and then that became an object which was verbally reported? And what about just the first saccade on those objects that were verbally reported? Okay, so to go back to here, we are going to basically repeat our very simple analysis of do people look towards salient things? But in one case, we just consider all the saccades. In another case, we are only going to consider those guys, 1, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11. So the saccades that were directed towards some object that was later reported. And we discard all the saccades that were directed towards things that were never talked about. And in the final case, we are only going to look at this first one. And so the hypothesis here, oh, maybe when this thing became salient, that attracted a saccade towards it and then made it that this object was going to be part of the verbal report. Okay. Yep.
So I would think you'd expect a delay between the saccades and the time that the item is mentioned.
Yeah.
Since there's some recognition that happens after the saccades, and then there's speech planning and
exactly insertion into the discourse and so on.
Yeah.
So yes. So when we do this analysis, we try to compensate for this delay, right? So when people tell you, oh, there is a man, this often happens much later after they have looked at it. But hopefully, since there is only one man, we can say that, oh, well, 2 seconds ago, he looked at that man here. So let me say that saccade number 1 was associated with the man. Okay. So of course, things can become ambiguous at times. And so there is, again, some subjectivity here, potentially. Yeah. All right, so we can look at this measure for our different observers. I'm going to skip the details and just focus on the end result, which is the following. So if we again look at this kind of scores, how predictive was the model? So for all saccades, we knew already that a salience map model is significantly above chance predictive of where people are going to look. Okay, so salience predicts where you are going to look. Here is the predictive power, if you want, of the model for the eye movements that were directed towards reported items. So what this seems to indicate is that, among all the things that we looked at, the ones that were talked about, they actually tended to be more salient than the ones that were not talked about. And this is even more true for the first time you look at one of those objects that will end up being reported. Okay. So all of this argues for the fact that very simple visual properties like this low-level visual salience may actually facilitate entry of information into your conscious scene representation and later what will become your verbal report. All right, so to conclude, let me just add that so we have looked at the theme of the talk is really to look at how can we do fairly shallow statistical analysis of data and make prediction of things that seem to be very complicated and cognitive. And what we have found so far is that, well, very often this simple statistical analysis of stimulus and of data in general is actually a fairly good heuristic to what we consider are very complicated cognitive processes, happening magically in our head. So the general conclusion is that, well, often there is a lot that can be mined with fairly shallow data analysis, and that would be actually a significant predictor of what we may consider are the results of very intricate cognitive processes. So if you're interested in more of this thing, all of the software is available. Also data, eye movement data is available. And of course, all the work is from my students and collaborators. And I'll take some final questions if there are any. Thank you. Yes?
Could you put on this, the slide which has all those references?
All the
Reference.
about that final experiment?
There was a slide which had references all over the place.
No, the table where you pointed out the green with the green area on the right corner.
With the green corner, yes. I'm getting there. It was just before this.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Yes. It's just yes. There is inertia in the system. Okay.
So here is a phenomenon. I mean, I look at it and immediately spot a Czech name, and I certainly don't look at it in order to spot the Czech name. I don't.
Yes.
Okay. And the name is not usual. I mean, it means it's Nájemník, which means renter, and.
This is quite a controversial issue. So there have been several reports in the literature with this kind of things, or that maybe your name. You know, if there was your name somewhere,
yeah, I know, I would understand,
then
but it's not.
maybe that's where you are going to look right away, or in this case, a Czech name. Yes. So this, of course, is a mystery for all those models, except that, well, maybe somehow there are some pattern statistics that are different in Czech name than they are in other names.
Not being a Czech person, I would think that Jelinek and Nájemník end in K, you know, and that is really an unusual, you know.
Well, I'm EK and that's IK, but.
I was thinking about something very similar and related. To what extent this could be applied perhaps to reading?
Yes.
When you read, fastly especially, definitely I don't read all the words.
Yes.
But that would help us as people who work in language. What is it, which words is it that we are looking at? Did anybody...
So we haven't done it, but I think there is indeed applicability of this surprise idea to this kind of reading model. So there are a lot of models, right, like Mr. Chips, and so models that predict how you are going to jump over the words, and in particular when you are going to make those regressive saccades, right? So sometimes you read, and then you realize, whoops, that's not what I thought, and then you make an eye movement back. And so there are models that can predict when those things are going to occur, and so we haven't tried it, but yeah, it's possible that surprise may contribute to this. Now, to finish with your question, so you are saying that, well, here there was maybe some semantic incongruency, and somehow that attracted my attention very quickly, even so there was nothing in the low-level statistics of the image, right? So it seems that this is very different. Yeah. So again, this is a controversial issue, whether this really exists or not. Okay. So one interpretation is that you didn't know, then you started reading the names, and then you realized, and then you somehow constructed this fantasy in which you looked there first, but that's not what happened. Okay. So that's one school of thought, and the other school of thought is that, well, there is indeed something, some of the semantic analysis which is done in like this pre-attentive, very fast manner, just like salience is computed, maybe also some, check detector is operated over the entire visual field. But the problem is of this school of thought is that people haven't been able to demonstrate how you would implement. How would you implement something that would take an image and very quickly direct you towards?
This is not the first time something like that happened for me. I was once reading the New York Review of Books, and there are personal advertisements, and they are mostly about sex and all that. And all of a sudden, so I open up the paper, and there I see a friend of mine. I mean,
yes,
his name is Krippendorf, and he's looking for an apartment in New York. So it was not sex, nothing that interesting. Right.
Well, maybe it was
a
statistical outlier too.
Knowing it before he didn't let me know.
Yes, so good question. I don't have an explanation for those things, but again, the only thing I can say is that the issue is controversial and hasn't been settled. Whether indeed you were able, and the problem is that the data is not very good, right? So if I was to record your eye movements, and those events are very rare and they are very subjective, so it's difficult to construct a principled experiment.
If I could rely on the fact that when I saw Nájemník, that this is the total list of Czech words.
Yes, but you don't know, right? You don't know how many times you missed your friends in the New York Times until that one time. Yeah, but I agree. It would be very nice if the data was conclusive, but again, yeah, so far it's not. Yes.
Now, is it possible to extrapolate the measure of surprise to not to time-dependent series, but only, for example, spatial, so to apply it to a static image.
Yes, yes. So indeed, we have done that. So I invite you to look at the paper. It's just coming out in Vision Research right now. So indeed, we actually combine those two measures of surprise, because again, if we just look at surprise at a given location over time, this is something that will not be able to predict those pop-out search arrays, when you have one element that is different from the other ones. So in order to make this prediction, you need to compute surprise somehow over space. And so the way in which we do that is we assume that the prior for a given neuron that is sensitive to a given location on the screen will be informed not only by the previous history of stimulation at this location, but will also be informed by its neighbors. And so the prior of a given neuron is shaped by both local information from the past and neighboring information from the present, from its neighbors. And both contribute to it. So definitely. So in the model that I showed you, those two components are already part of it. Yeah. Maybe.
So there was something that I found a little puzzling in the first part of the talk, which was maybe answered by the second part. You have this bottom-up notion of salience, and you showed that you have a measure of surprise derived from which uses those salience features. How well that measure of surprise does depends on which features you throw in and how heavily you weight them. So if, for example, you threw in a feature which instead of being the amount of vertical motion or the amount of green, was the intensity of the pixel at location 100, 100,
yeah.
Then you would often be surprised about the value of that pixel. Your prior on it is fairly flat. The more features like that you threw in,
yeah.
The less accurate your measure of surprise would be at predicting gaze. So a question is how that feature selection is done, and I guess a reasonable theory is that it has to do with feedback from which of those features predicted salience that correlated with task relevance for a particular task.
Yes, yes.
This might actually be an answer to Fred's question that he has many tasks in which recognizing his own name or check names or whatever is useful, and therefore
that may have created some feature. Yes, yes. So I think this is an extremely interesting question. Unfortunately, we just lack the CPU power to answer it. So ideally, we would want to run this whole thing in an optimization loop. So far, we have selected the features arbitrarily. We just looked at the literature about visual cortex, and it looks like there are edge detectors, and it looks like there are little motion detectors. So let's just put that into the model. It's possible that you would do better if you just try, as you say, to optimize task performance somehow, right? So let's just use the features that, so in this case, predict the eye movements the best. And so I wish we were able to do that, but again, so this is a multi-dimensional optimization problem, and just computing the cost function once takes about a day on 64 CPUs. So by the time we optimize the 60-dimensional space, it will take a very long time. So I'm not sure exactly how to approach this problem. But
you could try doing human subject experiments on transfer learning. So it may be that one task is able to shape people's people's selection of salience features in a way that transfers to another task.
Yes, yes. So I think that would be very interesting. Or maybe it is able to shape some very specific aspect of vision, a little bit like perceptual learning, but in such a way that would be predicted by the surprise model if it was correct. Yeah, yes. So I think that would be very interesting to look at. Yep.
Probably you can train some transform metrics on all the, like you can take the whole image and train some transform metrics on the image that will transform it to the lower dimensional space. That will actually contrast the.
You are saying to try to reduce the dimensionality. So,
yeah,
still the dimensionality of the search space is defined by how many features and what are the parameters of your features. So, for example, I could say, my low-level filters that I apply to the image will be defined by Haar wavelets, and now I have so many coefficients, and I just need to find the coefficients of the wavelets. Okay, so that's still a high-dimensional space, and this number of degrees of freedom, I cannot really get rid of it, right? So I could simplify indeed the.
You have the first page itself where you put some Haar wavelets, or you put some edge detectors, or you put some you have make a histogram of all the RGBs or those things. Instead of that itself, you train some transformative, maybe like.
Yeah.
So is that different?
I think I see your point, but so my point is that, well, in the end, it's still very high dimensional optimization with maybe on the order of 100 dimensions. So even if you manage to optimize your cost function a little bit from 1 day to say 1 hour, well, you still have a 100 dimensional optimization with a 1 hour cost function. Unlikely that you are going to converge anytime soon, right? So I think, yeah, but I think the direction in which you are thinking is clearly the right one. Just that reduction would have to be very dramatic for the problem to become actually tractable, Yeah. Yes?
Sorry, is it possible to use some higher level prior knowledge, for example, something that you talked on classifier using in the calculation of the surprise factor?
Yes. So in principle it is. Things become a little bit more difficult to implement because you have to somehow circumscribe what is the space of all those higher level hypotheses, right? And this becomes important when you do this Bayesian update. You want to renormalize so that you are still talking about probabilities. So for that, you need to know what is my entire space of all my possible hypotheses that I may have about the world, right? So for a single neuron, I can manage those things. For a whole human being, I invite you to, give it a try. Or if you have some ideas, we are very open to it. It's something which is clearly that's the direction in which we want to go. It's just a little complicated now because we need to somehow delineate that space. But clearly it would be extremely interesting to do some experiments and try to understand what the space is about. Yeah.
Can you go to the slide where you're comparing the surprise score with several other scores? My question basically is that so when you compute the surprise factor, you're essentially using multiple video frames to compute that. When you say entropy, how are you computing that?
Yes. This was not using multiple video frames. So this measure of entropy, again, I think I mentioned, it's very simple, and it's clearly not giving Shannon the best shot at at creating a model. However, we used it because this is, and we used it in this particular form, which is just to analyze successive patches of the image, just because other people had used that specific formulation in the past, and they had claimed that it was a good predictor. So here we used it more, it's more of an inside joke kind of deal that we wanted to say, well, yeah, sure, this kind of works, but this works even better. But I'm not claiming that this is Shannon's final word. And again, I invite you. The data is available, right? So please show me some model which will perform better than this one, right?
What actually I was going to ask is, it relates to the question asked about still images, is when you do still images, then, how is your surprise different from, computing entropy of a neighborhood?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So
comparing it to, other things like, scale space.
Yes. So it's still different in that. So what we do when we compute surprise over space is that we assume that your prior has been informed by the neighbors, and then you receive data at the specific location that you're interested in. So you receive local data, and you still do a Bayesian update. So you learn from this data. So given what I knew from my neighbors, and now I see a new observation, let me learn from it. So I can compute my posterior, and then I can still compute surprise. So it's still using the same kind of surprise computation, which is still different from saying,
the calculation is different. But I'm saying whether your detection is very different or not.
Like whether in the end the performance will be very different or not.
Still images or
good question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that, because what you are proposing is that maybe I should first build an entropy model which also is informed by the neighborhood like this, and that computes some kind of outlier metric. We did something similar to that. I don't have a very good answer to that at this point.
Or,
but
for example, other things that people use to detect interest points in images.
Yes, like Harris corner and these kind of things. So all of this, again, the game is open. If you think you can beat the score of 0.241, again, the data is available, so the video clips and the eye movement traces, and you can use some of those video clips to train your model and then test it. And And if you do significantly better than this score, then please let me know, and we'll try to improve and beat you again. But I'm certainly not. I'm certainly not claiming that this is the final answer or anything like that, right? I'm just saying that it's remarkable that we are doing above chance. I thought that this kind of very simple analysis of the video was not going to be predictive of something that is as high level and cognitively driven as eye movements. I thought I had freedom, that I would look wherever I wanted to look, but actually it looks like the stimulus is to some extent dictating where I look. Maybe a last one.
We are running out of time, so here's what I'll propose. We will close the seminar probably so that people who need to leave can leave, but those who still have questions can continue because the speakers need to. Let me make a quick administrative announcement. Those of you who have signed up for a course, there's a sign-up sheet which unfortunately skipped this part and ended up with the annual there. So just sign your name on your way out. But before we do that, let's thank our speakers again.